I thank you all for coming, and I thank all of those who are participating by Zoom. Welcome. You know that things are arranged so that you can ask questions from Zoom as you wish. I'd ask you to hold your questions until the question and answer, but if you're available, you can ask whenever you want to. It's a real privilege to have Faye here and to have Dena along with her. She will introduce Dena separately, and I'm just want to say a few words about Faye. I've known Faye for a number of years throughout her period, as long as she's been at Hewlett and before that as well. I brought like every good lawyer, you take notes on yellow pads. And so it happens that when I last interviewed Faye at the Hewlett Foundation was after she had done some really quite remarkable things, I thought. And the notes are here from what she had done. She created an organization at the Hewlett Foundation called the Fund for Shared Insight. The Fund for Shared Insight was one of the first examples I'd ever heard of in which foundations were concerned about how the people who ultimately got the dollars regarded the services that were provided. You know that every foundation gives money to an intermediary nonprofit, and we hear from the foundations, if you're in the we hear from the nonprofit people, the people running the nonprofit, but it's almost always the case, you never hear anything direct on the data about how the ultimate recipients of services thought about what they were receiving. And one of Faye's great contributions, I think, it's one I'll just simply talk about, was one that figured out how you could, in fact, not only do it for the Hewlett Foundation, but when I interviewed her, this was a few years after it was actually started, she'd gotten some 13 core funders who were willing to put up $250,000 a year, 70 co-founders for a part of the program related to it called Listen for Good, over 200 grantees, both of them focusing on listening to beneficiaries. They had, the attraction has been just extraordinary in terms of getting other organizations to join in with it. But the perception that she had about the indispensability of that bit of knowledge, I mean, you think about the billions of dollars that are going from foundations to nonprofits and to even the hundreds of millions of dollars, 100 million people who receive it, and yet no feedback. And so when you think about the world of foundations, and you think about the needs of listening to it, I don't know whether you saw the news story last week about McKinsey, I think it was McKinsey, who said, they asked her how she was going to make her decisions. She said, I'm going to listen to what nonprofits and their clients tell me.
Yeah,
about it.
Melinda Gates.
Melinda Gates, it was Melinda Gates. That's exactly right. So, it is a crucial bit of information that will soon be more widely available thanks to the initiative of our guest speaker today. And so I just, I use that as an example of the quality of creativity that Faye represents. And I've given you one example, but it's just one of many. And so I am honored to have Faye here to meet with you all and to have Dena with us as well. You'll hear more from Dena about her activities. But Faye, I can't thank you. I've tried for a number of years to get her here finally. And finally she's here, and I want to ring all the bells. So welcome, Faye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm got tears in my eyes hearing your praise and introduction, Joel, because it's such an honor to be here with you, such a luminary in the field and someone who I have long admired and learned from. So thank you for the invitation. And it took me a few years to get here, but now that I'm in Atlanta, I'm closer, and we maybe we'll come back more often.
Come back on a warmer day next time.
And a couple of things by way of introduction. Now, I am in Atlanta, based there as president of the Arthur and Blank Family Foundation, and here with Dena. Really happy to be here with Dena, who's part of the board of our foundation. And part of why I'm at this foundation, there's a lot of reasons, but part of it is because of Arthur himself, Dena's father, who, when I was in the interview process, I'm ad-libbing now, but when we were in the interview process and we were talking about the importance of listening to community and listening to the people that we're here to serve, he said, Faye, I've been listening for good my whole career. And I think that is really true, that he has really based listening to customers, whether it's Home Depot or sports team customers, fans, as central to good business practice. And Dena holds that same value in her work at the Candida Foundation. So anyway, it's a privilege to be here. And there are people I know who are on the screens. I feel like I've got old friends and new friends, and just that I cannot take full credit for everything to do with Fund for Shared Insight. It was a true collaboration, and there are people who played critical roles who are with us today, and appreciate them being with us. One of the things that animates my interests, and for both Dena and me, is Jewish values in terms of listening. And I know that's also near and dear to your heart, Joel. But there is a very sort of well-known Talmudic saying, which is, the wise person listens to everyone. And I think that, value is really what animates my interest in listening, both to experts and to nonprofit leaders and to regular people who may be in a hard way and needing some services. So I just wanted to say that is a through line for us. Values are, and they continue to be a through line for us as we continue to do this work and try to do it even better. One of the things, and we sent around, I think, an article to those of you who signed up for this session. And in the first article that I co-authored about the importance of listening, I co-authored it with somebody who's on this screen, Phil Buchanan, and it was about listening to the people who matter most, was the title. And we offered a framework, a very simple framework. I always prefer simple to complex when you can. And the simple framework was before, during, and after. When do you listen? You listen before you start to do something, while you're doing it, or after you've done it, you're trying to reap lessons. And so what you're going to hear from us today is you're going to hear a little bit from me about the during. That is sort of the rapid feedback loops, is the during. And what you'll hear from Dena is about the before. There's a lot to say about the after, but that will be for another time. Or the Q&A. So let's see, let me get to this. Oh, sure. Okay, so next slide. Thank you. So my journey here really began when I went up to the Gates Foundation. We moved up to Seattle, and I went up in 2006 to help the Gates Foundation at that time build a new team that would help all of the programs to do three things: strategy, evaluation, and a third thing, which was to help the foundation listen to outside voices. Those were the three parts of the job that I had when I went up there. And I went up there at a time when Warren Buffett had given his amazing gift, doubling the giving, and they wanted to be more systematic in their approach across the foundation. And so, not to underestimate the challenge of strategy and evaluation, it's complicated, it's hard, but the third part, that third leg of the stool, was really an interesting question for me, and I really didn't know exactly what shape it would take. And it wasn't until about a year in 2007 when I was sitting at my desk and I was thinking about that, and I had just a feeling in the pit of my stomach that we were really good at listening to experts at the Gates Foundation and looking at evidence. Important, really important. I'm not going to say it's not. It is. But we were really good at that. We were really good at listening, or we were getting better, I would say, with the help of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, getting better at, we had a pathway anyway for listening to our grantees, our nonprofit partners. And one day I just had a feeling in my stomach that what we really needed to do, we were so far away from the people that we were seeking to serve. We were nestled in this beautiful landscape of the Pacific Northwest, was that we needed to listen to the people that we were seeking to serve. Next slide. I went around and talked to leaders and programs, and we decided to start with, in the U.S. context, with students. The education team at the time was focused on small schools. Some of you may be involved in education. That was their big initiative, was on creating small schools and sometimes breaking big schools up into small schools. We had lots of data about those schools and lots of evaluations underway, but never had any of our efforts involve the students in understanding what their experience was with the schools. And so when I talked to the education team, they said, we're open to doing that. And I enlisted the help of the Center for Effective Philanthropy to help develop a student voice initiative. And I did that because CEP was very unusual in their ability to make data that would otherwise be complex, very digestible and actionable. And I remember I asked Phil Buchanan, who was the president then and still the president now, what about doing a student voice initiative, like a beneficiary feedback tool, like you do for grantee feedback tools? And he said, well, let's try it. I think it's going to be really hard, but we can try it. And we did. And so we developed a student voice initiative. We started with 20 schools. It took us about kind of 9 months to birth it. It was a fully collaborative process, working with schools and districts and students and researchers from the Chicago Consortium of Research and youth development experts, and MTV was part of it to help us in the how we were going to engage students in a cool, kind of youth-appropriate way. And we developed this system called Youth Truth, and it became a very sort of rigorous Youth Truth survey. Next slide. And there are these, and it's still going. There are 6 constructs that are part of the main student survey, and they are up here on the list. And each construct has various questions embedded in it. And I really love that little photo there that's included, because you can see it's not just the survey itself that is important, of actually listening to students, understanding their experience in the school, with their peers in the classroom, but also involving the students in engaging with the data when it comes back. And you'll see later, that's the quality of a high quality feedback loop is that the data are shared with the people who gave it to you in the first place, and they get a chance to help interpret it and define the action plan. And so here are these youngsters saying, here's what we can celebrate, here's where we need to improve, and here's our plan. And Youth Truth has been just an incredible tool. There are other tools in the marketplace. Next slide. But this, I think, is really the best one of those in the marketplace in terms of really lifting up student voice, and not just lifting it up so that schools and leaders hear students' perspectives and experiences, but also so that schools and student experience is improved. And there's lots of data and examples that they have about going in and surveying students, involving teachers and students in the digestion, and then making changes accordingly, and then the scores go up over time. So you really see demonstrated improvement in the student experience. And you can see there's over 2 million students surveyed. A few years ago, Youth Truth said, students are still central to our work, but families, parents and teachers also matter. So they added modules where parents and teachers also can be included. But you can't do Youth Truth unless you include the students. It's still the central part of what they do. But you can look and now triangulate data across those three sources and really get a very rich, really rich data set. One of the things that people used to say when we started off doing this was, well, does student experience really matter? I mean, it's a good thing, it's kind of a good thing to do, to listen, but what really matters is outcomes, and shouldn't we really be measuring outcomes? And we had a theory, we wanted to test it. We had a theory that actually perceptual data could be leading indicators of outcomes. We started this in 2008, and just this past year, SRI International did a very rigorous study looking at Youth Truth data and found that actually there's lots of predictive variables in the student perceptions that predicts math proficiency later on, reading proficiency later on. So student data is not just, and student feedback is not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. We made a bet on that, and it turned out the bet paid off. Next slide. One thing that you may, before we go on to the shared insight, I'll talk about that in a minute, but just a little postscript to the Gates story, because I started off saying, were we really listening to the Gates Foundation? Were we really listening to students? Was that part of the story? And by the time we actually got this going, Gates had moved on from the Small Schools Initiative, and they were doing other kinds of systems change initiatives. And so listening to students directly felt a little less relevant to them. And I left, and a couple years later, Gates stopped funding this project, but Youth Truth went on, is doing just fantastic now. I mean, really the rest of the school reform movement, I think, has caught up with the need to have more equitable tools for listening to students, and this has clearly shown up to be one. But last year during COVID, the Gates Foundation reached out to Youth Truth to say, will you help us understand the student experience during the COVID times when everybody's sheltering in place. And Youth Truth was able to take their tools, take their experience, and really the only set of tools that was able to really lift up what is really happening for students in their homes, and quite eye-opening findings there. Fast forward a few years, important years. I spent some time with Joel in Israel in those years, but we're going to fast forward to the Fund for Shared Insight that Joel was referencing. So in 2013, when I was at the Hewlett Foundation and thinking about, how can we make philanthropy more effective, a small group of us got together, 6 funders got together. I remember it was we had a bunch of markers and some butcher paper in an old conference room at the Ford Foundation, and we just began to say, what might we do together to help improve philanthropy and to help improve foundation practice? I was already inclined in this direction, but really we put a whole lot of ideas up on the wall, and we landed on how can we help create more meaningful connections between funders, nonprofits, and the people and communities that we're ultimately here to serve. And that became the purpose, really, of the Fund for Shared Insight. Next slide. As we got going on our work, one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, how do we really develop a feedback system at scale to use with all customer-serving nonprofits? So we had one experience, a great experience with Youth Truth in the education space, but what about all of the other customer-facing nonprofits out there? And we went and we did a bunch of learning and talking to organizations that cared about listening, and we found examples, but we didn't find anything that was ready to scale, because we thought if we could find something that's really working and ready to scale that we could use across all fields, we would invest in scaling that tool or that system. But we didn't actually find what we were looking for. Next slide. So we ended up creating a new system called Listen for Good. And the Listen for Good became sort of the signature initiative for the Fund for Shared Insight. Shared Insight has now expanded to do some other things, but that has really been a main signature initiative. Next slide. And really what the Listen for Good is a high quality feedback loop, which we defined as having these various stages of sort of designing the tool, collecting the data, interpreting the data, responding to what you get back, closing the loop. One of the interesting things, and we talked about this earlier with students, is that we made this a very deliberate part of a high quality feedback loop. It's not high quality unless you close the loop with the people who gave you the feedback in the first place. That's part of being kind of an equitable tool of really listening, because part of what happens, and many of you in this table around the table, and you want to experience this too, you're surveyed, and especially students, this happens all the time with students. They get surveyed, they're surveyed, up the wazoo, and then it feels like it goes into a black hole, right? So if it doesn't come back to them, they feel like it can be a little extractive. So we wanted this experience with people who may be vulnerable to make sure that we're closing the loop with them. Next slide. We developed a question set that was very simple, 5 questions. Any of you have done any measurement, usually you tend towards the complex. Here we tended towards the very simple. We actually started off with 6 questions, and we found that we were measuring the same thing kind of twice, so we limited it to 5. But they're very simple questions that would be asked of any person accessing a service from a nonprofit. How likely is it that you would recommend this organization or this program to a friend or family member? What is this organization or program good at? What could the organization do better? So you've got a mix of open-ended and closed-ended. How well has the organization met your need? And how often do the staff at this organization treat you with respect? Really basic questions. We've added demographics to the core, I'm still saying we, but they've added demographics to the core question set because partitioning the data by demographic variables is actually really important to see how different kinds of people are experiencing the services. Turns out to be really critical. So next slide. Just to go a little quick tour of the Net Promoter Score, which is the how likely are you to recommend. And most people around this table will have experienced the Net Promoter question. Probably last time you went to a doctor, or you got on an airline, or you went to a hotel or a restaurant, people ask you that question. How likely are you to recommend this, whatever, this restaurant, this hotel? And in the business world, this tool is ubiquitous, and there's a lot of empirics underneath it to suggest that a high Net Promoter Score is connected with strong customer loyalty. And so we wanted to test, so for instance, you can get so this is the way it works. Net Promoter Score, you calculate it in a very simple way. The detractors are, you rate something from a 0 to 6, you're considered a detractor. If you're a 9 or a 10, you're a promoter. You're likely to say, this is a great store, you should go there and buy their mangoes or whatever it is. You're going to say something really positive about. Passives are, you're kind of here or there. And then you get a score where you subtract your detractors from your promoters and you get a score. It's really simple to do. Most businesses who serve people use this score, and it's a measure of customer loyalty. So we said, well, could we try to adapt it? Could we use it in the nonprofit world for nonprofit customers and see if it works? And we had a lot of skeptics. Some of the skeptics are on this call, and who said, you can't really use it in nonprofit. You don't have the same amount of choice. There's power imbalance. Lots of reasons why. And we said, okay, well, maybe, but let's just see if it works. And we had good conversations with Fred Reichelt, who created the Net Promoter Score at Bain, and he was very eager to see if this could actually work in the nonprofit world. And we did move forward with it. Next slide. One of the things that's important about the Net Promoter and using data that can be compared, like with Youth Truth 2, that can be compared across sites is that you can develop benchmarks. So like the Net Promoter Score, if you're a specialty foods producer like Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, they tend to get very high Net Promoter Scores. If you're a telecom, you tend to get in the teens Net Promoter Scores. So you want to compare like to like. So after a couple of years, this is just from recently, last month, I got the most recent benchmarks. And you can see there's actually quite a bit of variation. Variation is your friend in the measurement world. It means that the tool is working. So where people said, you're not going to get variation, it's not really going to work. Well, actually, there is variation. The tool has held up technically, and even though they're skewed to the positive, because you can compare like to like, you still have a very good sense of, how are things going. So you can see that youth, the education programs, tend to have lower benchmark than, say, your safety net health clinics. So if you're in an after-school program, you want to be compared to other after-school programs. You don't want to be compared to the health clinics because you're going to look much worse on the percentile basis. So being able to have a full data set to be able to compare like to like matters a lot. So you can see we've added just a lot of rigor to the idea of what used to be kind of a simple customer feedback tool. You can now compare using benchmarks or comparing one site to many other sites. How does this site compare in terms of what we're doing well, where we could do better? Next slide. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. When we first started with the Listen for Good, we opened it up to the first, 46 organizations. And I actually thought that the organizations that we would work with would be those who didn't have particularly sophisticated measurement schemes and that who wanted to just get feedback in a systematic way, because most nonprofits who serve people do care about what their customers have to say. But turned out that Nurse Family Partnerships might be of interest to you over here, who is a very evidence-based. They started as a research project with helping pregnant women bring visiting nurses to help them through their pregnancy and their first year of birth. Very evidence-based, lots of strong outcomes in terms of birth outcomes, parenting outcomes, early childhood outcomes, but they had never systematically listened to the moms to understand what their experience was. And they applied to be a Listen for Good pilot effort because they had a new CEO and she wanted to listen to the moms. And so there was some friction in the organization about how the nurses felt about it, what would the moms say, and they were very close to them. So, but they managed to put together a data set of 10,000 names and numbers, and they sent out the Listen for Good tool to 10,000 moms, and in 20 minutes, they got back almost 1,000 responses. It was really something, because while we get asked, how do we feel about this hotel or restaurant, these moms had never gotten asked. Not in a way that felt safe to them, and not in any system. And the first thing they said is, thank you for asking. And then they had a lot of nice things to say about the nurses. So the nurses felt good because they actually, while they were worried, it is because it's a very personal job. But they also had a lot of ideas for how to improve. In terms of one of the things that the nurses would do. This was 5 years ago, was provide the moms with a binder, not unlike this, a binder of material about how to be pregnant in a healthy way and how to be a good parent. And some of these women moved from place to place, didn't necessarily stay in the place they were living for the full duration of their pregnancy and early childhood years. And they said, we love the information, but can you put it on an app? Yeah, and they just had never put it on it, and it was that kind of of course, once the idea occurred to them, it didn't occur to them, but once the idea came from the users, they said, yeah, we hadn't even thought about an app, and now they have an app, and And other things like, we love the materials, but sometimes you show us, moms who, with little babies who like are all dolled up and put all together, and it makes us feel like crap because we're like, we feel like maybe we should be looking better. But so show us real images of what it's really like. Things like that, they were trying to, present an image that actually, they were trying to do something good, but it turned out to backfire. I'm going to go to one, you got me going on one of my favorite topics, but I will one last example, and then I'll hand it over to Dena. So this is an example. It's a few years ago, but the Second Harvest Food Bank is a food bank in Silicon Valley. Now, Silicon Valley is, I'll try not to editorialize too much, but it is one of the wealthiest places in the world, and yet, this food bank that has multiple locations serves about 250,000 people per month. And so just take that in for a minute. And the people at the food bank who were participating in Listen for Good felt that there were more people who were food insecure than that. And they wanted to be able to reach out to everybody who was hungry, was food insecure, and invite them into the food bank for food if they needed it. And they felt that the reason that people don't come in to get food is for reasons of shame. And they wanted to really understand how were people experiencing their food bank experience. And so they administered the Listen for Good tool in 10 sites. And that's right. And these are the sites, and this is the NPS scores at these 10 different food bank sites. So you can see it's pretty high. Remember I talked to you earlier, or do we have a skew to the positive? It's definitely skewed to the positive. But if you look that in sites 7, 8, and 9, the scores are a little bit lower. And if you dig in to the data, one more time, you'll see that they looked at the difference in demographics. And here's what they found, that the Latino clients in those sites were having a much better experience than the Asian clients, primarily Vietnamese in this community. And they wouldn't have known that otherwise if they hadn't asked the question and they hadn't actually disaggregated the data by race and ethnicity. And they then followed up and they began to talk to customers, and they realized that there were issues around language. That the volunteers they had them for many years, lovely people, didn't speak the language. And the food offerings were not necessarily fit with the Asian diet. And then they began to realize that maybe they need to also put a site that is better placed in that neighborhood. So they began to make some adjustments to try to better serve that community. There's so many stories. If you go onto the Listen for Good website now, there are so many stories about what happens when you ask the questions, ask for feedback, and then disaggregate the feedback by race and ethnicity especially, but also gender identity. There are just clear patterns where some people will have a better experience than others. And you don't know really unless you ask. Next slide. So now this is Listen for Good. So you saw the original question we asked, could we develop a tool that's scaled? And now it is all over the country, and it's in partnership with SurveyMonkey and Listen for Good, and we've spun it out. It's its own organization and going really, really well. Next slide. And we are bringing it to the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation this year. So there'll be more organizations both in Atlanta and in Montana who are taking advantage of this listening. And these are all customer-serving organizations of different stripes, serving veterans, mental health services, children in soccer programs and food programs and so on. And we'll be working with these groups in a learning community to help them understand their customer experience, how they might do better, but also how we can learn from that feedback, and where we might need to be more sensitive and do better ourselves. So we're really looking forward to that experience and the wisdom that it yields for us. So with that, next slide. I'm just thrilled to introduce Dena to you, and you have seen her bio. So, she is currently the executive director of the Candida Fund, which she has led since its inception, and she will tell you about that. Before that, she had leadership roles at Teach for America, Teach for All, other ventures. But really what has been so special for me is that Dena is just a great board member for me. In my first year as president of the foundation, just been a great board member and colleague. And because she's also in this role of leading a foundation, and you don't have too many of other foundation leaders on foundation boards, and especially in family foundations, she, I think, it's been just a real gift to me in terms of, asking tough questions, but also appreciating the staff work that goes into bringing, board materials forward and pushing us in good directions, always. So anyway, I just feel really blessed.
Yeah. Thanks, Faye. Let's thank you. Can I ask you to return the favor? Thank you, Faye, and thank you, Joel, for hosting us. And it's just nice. I think it's one of the first rooms I've been in a couple of years, so it's truly a pleasure. Thank you. Faye talked about, you can go ahead and flip us forward, just this idea of listening to community. And when we decided to collaborate together on this talk, she was very gracious. She said, I think you should wear your Candida hat. I'll kind of talk blank, and so, but we're happy to answer questions about either. But what we kind of quickly realized is I had some things to say about listening to community on the front end of strategy development and program development, and she has this incredibly robust, which I'm not sure it fully came out in our interview process, so I'm just appreciating you even more now. So we're going to sort of backtrack, and I'm going to share a few stories about how Candida has really been dramatically impacted in how we've approached our work by listening to girls. I'll give a couple of girls and also gun violence victims. I'll give a couple of examples. And I'm also, so those are sort of reasons that I'll talk about that I think made our work better and more effective. And then I'll close with a little bit of why listening to communities has sort of elevated our spirit within our work. And I hope that's just foundation person privilege to speak to that a little bit. So you can go ahead and expand. A little bit about Candida, because I know you're probably like, what is this? I thought we were here for the Blank Foundation. Very quickly, the Candida Fund is also a family foundation. It's my mother, Diana Blank's foundation. It's been around for 30 years. I have not run it all 30 years, just the last 10. I was off in the nonprofit sector for a lot of years before that. But even in our mission statement, communities has existed. Since the beginning, we have always worked to support individuals, but we have been also operating very much at the community level, both in Atlanta and Montana, if you want to move ahead. About 30 years. Candida is not a biological disease, although maybe it is that too, but it's the name of my mother's 3 children, my older brother Kenny, myself, Dena, and my little sister, Danielle Candida. We have 6 programmatic areas, 2 place-based in Montana and Atlanta, where my mom spends the majority of her time, and then 4 more issue-focused areas that are mostly national and 1 international program. We're pretty small. We have when we get together, there's about 8 of us around the table, but that's really translates at an FTE level to about 5 people. So pretty lean. We don't really have a board. It's really my mom is the decision maker. And over the course of our history, we're just shy of $1 billion. We are really close to spending out. The end of 2023 is our spend out date. And we're excited about that. That's another discussion altogether. But really quickly on the spend out, the one thing I want to say is a few years ago we really wrestled my mother unwillingly to the ground and sort of forced her to grapple with this idea of legacy and what would be her legacy. It was a hard exercise for her. But when we did it with her and she did it with us, one thing that really came out was just as much about the how we worked as the what we accomplished, and that was really important to her to think about Candida's legacy in that way. And you'll see there's a word, I'm not going to read the whole statement, but there's a word in there that I think is emblematic and very relevant for this talk today, which is curiosity. My mother was an anthropology major in college. She is deeply curious about the way the world works, the way people work, other communities, other cultures, nature, all of it. And she comes to new situations, new problems, and experiences, first and foremost with curiosity, usually not with a lot of assumptions and ideas and preformed half-baked theory. So that has set us up really well when we're going into a new community or an issue area to approach first with curiosity. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, so the two examples I'm going to share, one is in our girls' rights space, the other is in our gun violence space. So in our girls' rights space, we have been working for the last 10 years on the issue of early and child marriage around the world. And when we started deciding to work on this issue, very quickly as we entered the field, we ran smack into the dominant frame at that time on the problem of child marriage, which is really exemplified in this photo. At that point, 10, 12 years ago, the issue of child marriage was generally understood and communicated as the issue of very young girls being married off to much older men, primarily as a consequence of family poverty. The result of that, understandably, of that frame, dictated a set of strategies that focused first and foremost on protecting children, protecting girls. This photo is dramatic and captivating and horrifying, but it is also kind of wrong. As we dug into the data in South Asia, we understood that while there are marriages that look like this, the vast majority of early and child marriages are really typically an adolescent girl being married off to an adolescent boy who may be slightly a few years older. But understandably, with this frame, the way that it was, the focus was very much on protecting girls. And grant makers who were doing great work in the field had concentrated disproportionately on a set of solutions that were focused on protecting girls. So for example, laws, national laws, with a lot of focus on passing laws to raise the minimum age of marriage in a country from maybe 15 to 18 or 18 to 21. There were a lot of strategies, a lot of money, and a lot of work poured into doing things to incentivize parents who were in poverty to make different choices for their daughters. So just a conditional cash transfer where a family might be given $500 or a goat to delay the marriage of their daughter for a number of years. The problem was, as we started doing work and we had the benefit of speaking with girls across South Asia, both ourselves and a partner named Narantar who we worked with, told us is that that really wasn't what was going on in their lives, and that in their own words, this was not a problem necessarily of poverty, because they saw their brothers were still getting to go to school and were not yet getting married off, et cetera, but this was really a problem of how they were viewed within their family or within the community and within the society. And for them, this was not their phrase, it was mine, but and others, was that this was really a problem of patriarchy and the value that was given to girls in that community, and also of a desire to control over a young girl's body, and that by marrying her off as she came into adolescence, they could sort of ensure that she was sexually pure, and that she was going to be an honor to her family and to the community. And so this issue of patriarchy was rampant for girls in terms of not just the age of their marriage, but also what kind of aspirations for their lives could they have. And we heard time and again from girls that age of marriage laws were irrelevant if nothing else about the girl's life was going to change. If she was married at 17 instead of 14, but she had no agency or control over any other aspect of her life. It wasn't particularly helpful, and the same with conditional cash transfers. And so they argued for a wholly different frame on the problem, which was one of patriarchy, not just poverty, and a wholly different set of solutions to be invested in. Which included sort of gender transformative programming that lifted up girls' sense of agency and their aspirations. If they're going to advocate to a government, they asked us, don't advocate for laws at marriage, advocate or ask your partners to advocate for laws that, or resources that would fully fund girls' secondary education and make it gender responsive, fund girls' tertiary education, fund sexual and reproductive rights and health services, fund livelihood opportunities for girls, forget the age of marriage laws. And so as a philanthropist trying to follow the lead and voices of girls and some of the grantees we served, we made the shift fairly early on in our funding of the child marriage work. And I think what's been interesting is it's catalyzed a wholly different set of actors into the space now, 15 years later, not solely by us and our work alone, by no means, but as one of, I think, several funders who were redefining this problem, listening to girls. You have a very different set of actors who've now defined this problem as their own, and unleashed a whole lot of energy and resources, starting with the incredible organizing power of adolescent girls themselves to make those changes. And you're seeing, I think, a lot of funding also flowing in a very different way. So that's the first example. Oh, I'm sorry, I totally forgot. You're seeing what I'm doing here. Yeah, new framing, old framing. We'll move on to guns. Okay, so similarly in our gun violence work, like other funders in the United States, some but not all, we entered the gun violence prevention space in the wake of a significant national mass tragedy, which was the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012. When we started learning about gun violence work, of course, we encountered quickly a gun violence movement that had been very squarely focused on federal and state traditional gun control laws. It's been a movement whose agenda has been defined at that point really by inside the Beltway policy experts, and also I would say was overwhelmingly white at the time. A few years into the funding, representing Candida, I had a chance to participate in some listening sessions held by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. They were held in urban centers around the country. This one is in Milwaukee. I'm in the back in the aqua suit there. Feels like a lifetime ago being in a room without a mask. But anyway, these listening sessions, the one that I attended here in Milwaukee, it had a lot of community members, faith leaders in community, formerly incarcerated individuals, local service providers, community members themselves, and joining the session were some other funders like me, as well as some traditional gun violence prevention folks, mothers, Everytown, the kind of traditional gun violence actors. And really, like anybody sitting in that room for those couple of days, what they would have heard if they listened, and I think people were listening, was an almost wholesale repudiation of the strategy of focus on a set of policies around restricting access to guns. And instead, what we heard from community members, they saw gun violence as a result of disinvestment in their communities, of intergenerational trauma, of fractured relationships with law enforcement. And they even further said gun control laws, to the extent that they're enforced in our communities, are really just become an excuse to incarcerate more black men in our communities. And even furthermore, is they saw very little difference between the perpetrators of gun violence and its victims. And somebody who was a perpetrator one day might be a victim another day. And instead, and you can advance the slide, what they asked us for, well, I don't even need it because I know it, was, thank you. It's okay, I got it, I'm good. What they asked us for was a focus on violence prevention strategies and to look at healing trauma within their communities and to focus on gun violence as a public health emergency and as a social justice crisis. And so a fair bit of our funding went that way. And I think for me, both of those situations, in addition to sort of listening to community members themselves, is if we had stopped with a typical field survey where we had just looked at who are the major players in this field. It was the child protection folks, it was the folks in the case of child marriage, and it was the gun control law folks in the case of our gun violence work. I think if we had stopped with a field survey and stopped with just talking to kind of the big players in the space, we would have missed out for ourselves on these different frames, some 10 years ago. So that's been, and I can give other examples, but those are two examples of sort of listening early had a dramatic impact on the way our whole strategy and funding was shaped. I want to switch gears a little bit. It's my mom. And just talk about the other rationale for sort of listening to community. It's a little more personal and a little more squishy, but I think anytime you meet with somebody in philanthropy, if they try to pretend like it's all strategy, it's just not true. We all bring ourselves to the work and who we are. And for me, I think the pivot toward better listening to communities, I think, has elevated my spirit in the work in our grant making. And I'll say that when I first approached this job as executive director 10 years ago, not 30, with my mom, and even in my role at the Blank Foundation, I think I had this very strong frame in my head, one of those 10 commandments, honor thy mother and father. And I saw for me that it was just the ultimate opportunity and expression to honor my mother in this work by taking on this role, certainly more than I did as a teenager, honoring my mother. She reminds me all the time. So as I took on the reins of Candida, she encouraged me, make this your own and do this your own way. But I was very oriented, I would say almost wholly oriented toward ensuring that her vision and her values and her interest and her spirit stayed front and center, even as her role changed and we brought on new team members and started working in new areas. And the phrase, what would Diana do, WWDD, became like a mantra in our team. And I felt like at the end of any given day or week that I had done my best job, my best work, when I was very centered in her vision. But over some time and, frankly, my own maturation, it really started to feel very insufficient and uncomfortable. As we grappled with the ideas of equity and our role in communities, we considered our legacy. It didn't feel right that my focus should be so wholly centered there as opposed to more balanced. And so I had a friend who, and I started kind of playing with this idea in my head of joint accountability to community. I had a friend, a woman named Kim Anderson, who I want to just name her because I think it's important to give credit to people who have great ideas. She really has encouraged me to think of this idea of a covenant, and I like that because it has its own, in my faith, religious orientations, which is a promise. And when we do work in communities, we are really making a covenant with whether it's a neighborhood or a social movement, which is a promise that we're making for them. And the idea of a covenant for me has been elevating, and it requires conversation and mutual agreement. And sometimes it has been very much, oftentimes in concert with the idea of honoring my mother, but sometimes in tension. And so, do I have a minute to give one example? Yeah? Okay. So one example of where it has played out in terms of tension. There was a local foundation in Atlanta with whom we have a fiduciary relationship. And months after the murders of Rayshard Brooks, who was a gentleman in Atlanta, and George Floyd, this foundation offered COVID relief grants to a number of nonprofit organizations in a particular sector in Atlanta. And they gave out dozens and dozens of grants, and when they announced them, it became very clear that none of the grants were given to Black-led organizations. And many of our grantees in our Atlanta equity portfolio were really upset. And they pointed out very publicly the flaws of this foundation's grant-making processes, and they demanded changes. And then they came and talked to us. And they saw us as in a covenant with them. And they didn't use exactly that word, but it was really much more than we want your money and your money has been helpful, as we want your help and we need your support in this moment. What would Diana do would be to put our heads down and just say, we're going to do a better job. Who are we to judge? She's not a caller-outer. She's a very humble person. We try not to have a big profile. But they were asking us to do more, and our Atlanta Equity Fund Advisor kept me with them in conversation for a lot of hours because I was really uncomfortable. This is not Diana style. But they said, we need you to do more. We believe that you can do more. We're asking you to do more in this case. And so we did do more, I think, in a way that was consistent with our style and values. But I think it was a good example of elevating, for me, the spirit of philanthropy, which is more relational with the communities in which we're serving and goes beyond just the grant dollar. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Dena and Faith, thank you very much. Your formal presentations, both very interesting. And now we come to the question and answers. You can start here with any persons here in the room or on Zoom. Call in, right? Can I call in from Zoom?
Yes,
I'll get started. Great presentations. Really enjoyed it. Question about the growth for Listen for Good. I'm wondering the driver. Was it more the grantees that were interested in listening, or the foundations that were interested in listening to inform their work?
It's a great question. I think it changed over time. So when the Listen for Good initiative was first getting started, the first 46 organizations that were part of that pilot prototyping phase, it was roughly half and half because we gave a grant.
I'm sorry, can you use your
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Let's see. I'll just start from the beginning. So it was really mixed. The first 46 organizations that we piloted it with, prototyping it, we gave a grant. We didn't know how much it was going to cost. I think we used a $60,000 grant. But it was like we were building it for the very first time, and we wanted them to learn with us. And it was about half and half. Half were funders who nominated organizations, and we set this up always as a matching grant. So that was how we got all these other funders involved in this sort of movement around, that's part of the story I didn't tell you, but this whole movement around feedback was that we did matching grants. So the national group of funders matched local grants in the beginning, and funders would nominate organizations to participate, and the organizations who participated had to have a nominating funder. So it was half-half at the beginning, and it sort of throughout that matched grant funding period, which went on for a few years, it stayed, I think, roughly half-half. I don't know, Gita is on the call, I saw, she could maybe correct me, but roughly during that period it stayed about half-half, and some of the funders did some really interesting things. The Moses Taylor Foundation did some interesting things where they had, multiple, because they're smaller foundations, multiple of them pooling together to put up the $15,000 to nominate an organization, a grantee that they shared in common, and they had learning communities, so they would all learn together, both the grantees and the funders. So it was a mix. Half of the time the organizations heard about it, wanted to do it, and found a funder to fund them. It had to be new money, and so there were a few rules to it. So I think it remained about half-half. And now that Listen for Good is spun out, I think when I last spoke with Valerie Threlfall, who leads Listen for Good work, now the price point has come way down. Like you can do Listen for Good for $1,000. It's very inexpensive compared to other measurement efforts that are this good. Now it's mostly driven by the nonprofits themselves, I think.
Good. Any questions? There you go. Damon.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Both your presentations were wonderful. Thank you. This is for Faye. So you've seen The Wizard of Oz, and they're all Toto.
Many times.
Right, so Toto and Dorothy are like at the crossroads, and there's a road this way, and a road this way, and a road this way.
Yeah.
And they went that way.
Yeah.
The question for you is, you're in that Ford conference room, you got the butcher paper out,
Yeah.
and you don't go the way you go. I would love to hear one or two examples of the other roads you might have taken.
It's so interesting that you asked that question
Because
because
what's your paper here?
because because of that very question, I stopped including the other ideas in the board memos that we used to give to the Hewlett Foundation board. They'd be like, well, what about that idea back in the appendix? But here are a few of them. One was, there's this idea about a common app for foundations. There's a common app for colleges, and everybody thinks that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everybody doesn't really know much about it. And everybody, from my whole career, even before I went inside philanthropy, when I was just, a consultant outside doing valuation work, everybody used to always talk about, can't we have a common app? And it's so cumbersome to deal with all these different applications that foundations have. Wouldn't that be so much easier? And there have been so many efforts to develop a common app, and they have all pretty much failed. But that was one of the ideas that got put up there, and it just felt like such a well-rutted. We were just going to fall right into one of those ruts, and it just felt so uninspiring. One of my colleagues who I used to work with at Hewlett said, nothing happens until somebody gets excited. So there could be, equally, it's sort of about bringing the spirit to it. Like, somebody has to be excited about really pushing this idea forward. No one was especially excited about the common app. Let's see, that was one. Another one had to do with, I think, developing more frameworks around how funders could get, more involved in policy work. It wasn't a particularly fleshed out idea. There was another one which I kind of liked, but we didn't do, which was about, and this would be most relevant for larger foundations, but doing swaps. So like, Dena's at the Candida Foundation, I'm at the blank foundation, and you swap, you sit in different seats for a few months. So you get kind of like not exactly a sabbatical, but you learn how other foundations work from being on the inside. Those were a few.
Questions from the Zoom?
Yes, Professor James Charlesworth, if you'll unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Joel, for including me, and thank you for the presenters. I'm, I guess, speaking as president of the Foundation on Judaism and Christian Origins, and I'm talking to you from Mount Lucas in Princeton. I live in Jerusalem and here. Now, I'm going to try to get my question, and it's not easy to bring it together. I'll start with some observations. I've enjoyed and learned tremendously and want to applaud your comment. Are we sure we are doing the right thing? Are we sensitive to those that we're trying to be sensitive to? Most of the past has been training the teachers, but not training the teachers to be sensitive to students. Now, I will give you several examples. One of my children came to me and said, I have to call a family council. And I said we did, and we sat on the floor and made a circle, and she said, I have to announce I will not make it. She was 5 or 6 years of age, and I said, I had to be careful not to laugh. Tell me, why do you think you can't make it? I went to your office and saw your books. And then I tried to copy my name and I threw the paper out. I do that every day in school. I try to put my name on paper, but I cannot do it perfectly as your book is perfect. I went and showed her my wastebasket, and she was horrified to see pages corrected and rewritten. My point is, in phenomenology, they teach you the tacit cogito. Before we open our mouths, before we put our clothes on, we've always spoken. So my question comes around this: how can we be sensitive to what we are saying without realizing we're saying it? How we come into a classroom, how we listen, and I think that's the key today, learning how to listen. Each of you have made it clear. none of us, we have so many special sessions on how to speak, speech therapists, teachers of speech, but who is teaching how to listen? I think the first thing we need to do in listening is stop. Quit thinking about what we want to say. I was just on national radio, I guess it might have been TV, and the person that I was talking with, I said, I've been asked to talk, but you want to argue. And he refused to listen, and I said, well, which one of my books have you read and profited from? He says, I won't read anything you write. I said, well, how do you know what I write? This gives you an idea of how complex articulation and communication is. So I guess I'm going to try to put it, I'm sure many of you see a question there. Let me see if I can answer the question. How can we get beyond admitting students when almost all of the law schools are not able to study people, they are studying statistics. If you have 10,000 people applying to colleges, great colleges, they're no longer looking at what is written. They won't admit it, they're looking at statistics, whether they do objectively. Now, none of us listening feel that objectivity is a way to subjectivity. So I guess there's a lot of questions there,
Yeah.
and you can pick them up as you go.
Well, yeah. Look, I will, this seems like way above my pay grade, but because you referenced Jerusalem, I'm going to pick up that thread. And because you're asking a really, a series of complex questions about listening that requires sort of active listening, but also reflecting on what you're hearing, trying to take yourself out of it, and really, pay attention to what people are saying in the context that they're saying it in. But I learned an important lesson from the year I spent in Jerusalem. It was a year that I spent a little time with Joel, and I went there between the Gates Foundation and the Hewlett Foundation. I spent a year working with the Rothschild Foundation, and I was there kind of as like an expert, helping them. They had been around for 100 years, and they were wanting to be more strategic in their work. They're a very soulful organization, but they were wanting to be more strategic. And I know Leora is going to listen to this later when it's recorded, so I'm sending you a hello, Leora, when you listen to this, because it's very late there now. But one of the things that I really learned from that time, because I would sit in these meetings, leadership team meetings, where all languages, many different languages were spoken. But I could understand a lot of Hebrew, but I wasn't professionally conversant. So it was good because it took my expertise down to a level like when I got the coffee, I sounded like a second grader. And I could talk about certain things, but not about real professional matters. But one of the things I really learned from sitting in those meetings was how much happened that wasn't verbal. So I learned to listen to all the body language, because I couldn't track all of the nuances of what people were saying, but I could track how they were feeling, how their body was, and who they were looking at, and who they weren't looking at, and who wasn't talking, and why they were slumped, or who came late, all of the other indications of what was happening. And I think that's, to your point, James, what teachers need to do. So, the best teachers notice, the best parents notice, best friends, but I think there's so much that is communicated that doesn't get communicated verbally or even in surveys, as valuable as those tools can be, and we talked about the value of them. I think there's a lot that goes on that we just need to be keen observers of.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is exciting. I'm very much with you and love the idea that we need to listen to the people we're working with. My question is, how do you, recognizing that the stated needs and goals of the folks you're working with are constrained by their circumstances, how do you know when to accept their stated goals versus dig deeper in a non-arrogant, non-condescending, non-presumptive way? Here's an example. The work I do is with families giving birth. And we try to understand what their needs are here in Durham. And a number of our families, particularly living in East Durham in housing projects, don't want to go to well baby pediatric visits. They want us to stop pushing that, quit that. That was a goal of ours, healthcare. Absolutely not. We could have accepted it. But in digging deeper, we realized they want a healthy baby. But their experience of pediatric care was so bad that they wanted to reject the whole thing. I remember going to a woman's apartment in East Durham and spending enough time with her to have her say, tell me why. And her story was, well, I have to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop because the city won't provide a bus to the housing project. And I have to get on and pay with a screaming baby. Then I get off after a long bus ride and I have to walk another mile to the clinic where I can see the pediatrician. And it's a clinic and they won't take appointments, so I have to wait for 3 hours, right, to see if they can see me. And then maybe they see me and I get 12 minutes, and then I have to turn around and go all the way back home. Would you do it? My baby's healthy. She's 7 weeks old. And I was, oh, you do want a healthy baby and a pediatric care, but now I understand other needs. You want the bus to come to your house. You want to get an appointment like a middle class person. You want these other kinds of things. How do you dig deep enough to understand the real needs, but do it in a non-condescending way? Right? How do you get to that layer with the families you're working with?
It's a great question, and you, in a way, you asked a great question and you answered your own.
Well, I answered it, but I'm not sure that 100% of the time we can get to that layer.
Yeah, and you can't. So there's another question that you didn't ask, but that was kind of right a cousin of that question, which is, what happens when people, like, what I love about your answer to your question is that you demonstrated that sometimes when people say something that doesn't actually fit with your program or fit with what you know to be good practice or fit with what you know would really drive better outcomes, how do you make sense of it, and how do you choose between what people are saying and what the evidence would say, right? There's those kinds of questions that come up. But what I love about what you demonstrated is that when it didn't make sense, you went deeper to really understand not just the, as they would say in the legal world, not just the position, but the interest, right? So you went all the way into understanding, well, why and why? Tell me more about that. And so you got to, now you have a whole set of barriers to this woman getting to the doctor for the appointment that you can actually think about, how can we solve it? Maybe we do, mobile something or other. I don't know what the solution set that you could come up, but all of a sudden more solutions open up to you because you didn't really realize what all the barriers were. So that's, I do think, and that's sort of what happened with the food pantry, where they began to actually talk, well, what are the issues? Oh, it's language, maybe there are cultural competence issues, maybe there's food selection. So that when you actually have further conversation, you realize, okay, well, these are all issues, let's try different ways to address those issues rather than having people feel ashamed to come in, because if they feel ashamed or not treated well, that's actually going against the essential mission of that food pantry in the first place. But there's another question that you didn't ask that is related that people often wonder about, which is, what happens when I get conflicting, we can't do everything, and sometimes there really are constraints on what we can do. And what if we don't have the budget, or what if we don't, one person says, I want you to be open on the weekends, another person says, I want you to be open in the evenings. You can't do both. What do you do? And that, you don't sort of take your judgment and just hang it in the closet when you get feedback. You still have to, whenever you get feedback of any kind, you have to consider it along with the evidence, along with what your budget constraints are, and think about, well, what can we realistically do? And we really understand this as fully as we can right now. Maybe we're closing the loop. We say, here's what we're going to do. We hear you that a common refrain of feedback is that clinic hours or service hours are inconvenient for people who need to access those services. They're 8 to 5. Well, people, if you're working 8 to 5, evening or weekend service hours are better, but the people who work in these clinics want to work 8 to 5. So there's a little bit of tension there, and if you can't meet all of the interests, how do you meet some of them? And you can say, look, we heard you want hours in the evening and in the weekend. We heard you. That's a really important first step. I can't overstate that. Having people feel heard, listened to, is really important. And then say, here's where we're going to start. We're going to start by opening up, Saturday afternoon hours and see how that goes. We're going to check in, and if we can swing it, we'll also open up an evening. But here's how we're going to start because we've heard you. And so, and I think you can do the same thing when there are budget constraints, and people understand that too. That you're taking a step, you're creating a virtuous cycle of listening and responding, continuing to listen and respond.
Thank you. We got one question back here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us your experience. I am wondering
Would you
what...
take off your mask? We can't
Okay.
explain.
I am curious about what happened after you collect the feedback, after you open the space for listening the people you serve, and maybe if like Listen for Good or any of the experience that you have lived, also create like a systematic way to incorporate the feedback of the people, and also how from the perspective of the donors, you help the nonprofits to incorporate the feedback, and also maybe create accountability or social accountability of this feedback, because in most of cases, like we collect feedback and after that, what happened with the actions. So I would like to hear from you some experiences and tools.
Yeah, there are some great stories. I'll just, because I'm aware of the time, contain it to one, which is the Youth Truth. We'll go back to that example from earlier, because a lot of schools have kind of gotten religion lately about listening to students and trying to have more equitable tools to bring to the classroom experience. A lot of schools now have like these, I forget what they're called, you might know, like these educational improvement plans. There are all these, in California there's like these dashboards and all kinds of requirements that the schools and districts, I think it's mostly at the district level, have for what are you tracking, what are your targets for change. And a lot of the schools that have done Youth Truth have incorporated, there's a great example, there's one on the Youth Truth website from the San Jose School District about incorporating student voice into their, performance scorecard for the school. So in addition to grades and matriculation, discipline reports and things like that, they now also include many of these districts of here's what the students are saying, here's their level of engagement and their relationships with teachers. And we went from students feeling like the teachers didn't care about them, they were the lowest percentile, to now they're in the highest quartile of feeling like the teachers do care about them. That's huge. So they track that and they set targets for we're going to move from this percentile to that percentile. And so that's a form of really baking the student feedback into these accountability mechanisms that where they track it over time, year over year. Some of them do it within calendar years so that they really drive to, in this case, they drive to the positive result of the test, which is the student feedback is more positive.
At the level of movement, I think the gun violence space, was facing a reckoning of realizing that their movement did not reflect many people who ought to be a part of their movement. And so I'd say in the longer term, they have done, I think, tremendous work in the last 5 or 6 years of changing who's on the staff in those organizations, and ultimately what they're advocating for. And so you do see now a lot of the more traditional gun violence movements having listened, the gun violence organizations having listened to people in communities and starting to advocate. If you look at some of Biden's things, which I guess will now never become a law, but there is a lot of community violence money built into some of those budgets, and a lot of it has to do with gun violence organizations who have now, I think, been able to successfully do some pivoting, both by listening, but also by changing the composition of who's really serving in those organizations as staff and board.
Thanks, all of you. Thanks very much for attending the Foundation Impact Research Group seminar with Faye Twersky and Dena Kimball. We're delighted to have you here. Lots of fascinating questions. When you heard my introduction, you may have thought that I exaggerated things. When you hear the questions that were asked here, you realize that a lot has come from what Faye has done in this field. So I thank Faye and Dena for coming. I thank you all for coming. Let me just remind you, the next FIRG session is with John Rice, founder and CEO of Management Leadership for Tomorrow, which is a leading organization in recruiting African American men and women and other minorities to business schools. 20-year-long, over 2,000 people have been put into business schools at that point that came through that program, and maybe more than that by now. In any event, and finally, on the last FIRG session of the semester is on April 6th. Sam Gill, president of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. So come back, ask your questions, think about the sessions, think about the questions that I asked today, and I will welcome any, and I'm sure that so will Faye, and Dena, any comments that you have about that. Thank you all. Thank you for making the time.